franktalks.com.
This program does not represent the views of this station and may be considered offensive to some listeners. This program may contain mature subject matter, including frank discussions of controversial topics. It is intended for mature, open-minded audiences. Discretion is highly advised. This program is entirely independently produced by and is copyrighted by Frank. It is broadcast here under license.
Hi, this is Nancy Leclerc from Bisexuality Montreal, and you're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyles.
You're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be. On today's show, we have Nancy Leclerc, who represents the organization Bisexuality Montreal. Welcome to the studio, Nancy.
Thank you, Frank.
Let's go right into the interview.
Okay.
What is Bisexuality Montreal?
It's an association that caters to the Montreal area bisexual community. And thus far, most of our clientele is, well, not clientele because it doesn't really cost anything to come to our activities, but most of the people who come to our activities are mostly francophones, but we're having more and more anglophones. So I think it's safe to say that it's getting closer to being a bilingual as well as bisexual association. And we provide, discussion groups, activities, all kinds of things.
Would you categorize it as a dating service for bisexual people?
Definitely not. That is not really our goal. It's the kind of thing, what we tell people is that, like any other social group, it's quite possible that you might meet somebody there, as you would at work or at any social group, but it's not the point of the association. It's really for people to network and make friends and just feel a little bit less isolated than they normally would. So people who come to try to pick up are usually kind of disappointed because it's a very different dynamic than that.
You mentioned the word isolation, and can you tell me how does isolation play into the life of a bisexual person?
It could if the person has never met any other bisexuals and they're questioning themselves as to the validity of this particular sexual orientation, and if they feel that they have no models or nobody to really express themselves with. What happens often is that if they go to gay or lesbian groups, sometimes they'll feel a little bit outcast because if they want to talk about their opposite sex attraction in addition to their same sex attraction, there's a risk of being ostracized. It's getting better. The queer community is becoming more accepting, but there is always a little bit of a factor of, even in the queer community where I'm supposed to feel comfortable, I still don't completely fit in. So that can play into it quite a bit, in addition to the regular homophobia that most queers have to deal with. So that's what I would say in terms of isolation.
What would you describe the life of someone who is bisexual but hasn't yet met another bisexual?
It's hard to say. I've met people who have never met another bisexual before and who didn't really worry about it too much because they were perfectly comfortable with it. So if the person's comfortable with it, it probably wouldn't be a huge issue. But for somebody who might come from a background where any non-heterosexual orientation was really taboo to talk about and they had nobody with whom to feel comfortable, they might feel quite a bit intimidated or ostracized from pretty much all directions. So I'm guessing it would be a little bit lonely, a little bit scary, quite a bit intimidating.
I'd like to turn the attention to something a little bit more personal, so that our listeners can get the benefit of your own personal experience. Are you bisexual?
Yes, I am.
All right. When did you first discover that you weren't either heterosexual or gay?
It's kind of a long, twisted process, but I'll try to wrap it up in a nutshell. When I was about 7 or 8 when I started thinking about sexuality, and right away I knew that there was an attraction to girls. I mean, I would have these ideas in my head of being with girls and of being with boys, and sometimes I would be a boy, or sometimes I would be a girl. It really varied quite a bit, but I was at this Catholic school, and right away I knew instinctively from what was going on around me that this was something that I had to kind of submerge and not really talk about. So I kind of submerged it for a long time. It's really when I was in my late teens that these thoughts started to come back again, and mostly through fantasy. I mean, it just came about kind of unexpectedly, because I would just be, having my usual fantasies with guys or something, and then one fine day, this woman just magically appeared in my fantasy, and it was like, what the heck are you doing there? And that kind of freaked me out a little bit, because I didn't know the term bisexual at all. I didn't know it was possible. I just knew lesbian, and that was... lesbian would be the worst possible thing in the world to be, to me, at that point, at 16 or 17. So I submerged it again, and it was in about my early 20s when I started to accept it more. I took a women's studies class at university. I met real live lesbian and bisexual women who were proud about it and who didn't think it was anything nasty, and so I started to really accept that about myself. Before I had ever even been with a woman, it was all in my head, and I kind of knew that this was okay. And
I'd like to talk about your upbringing. You mentioned that you had gone to Catholic school. Where were you born, and can you share with us some of those elements of your upbringing that you found maybe challenging dealing with your bisexual thoughts?
Okay. Well, I was born in Sherbrooke, Quebec, but I actually grew up in a small town called Fishkill, New York, which is about halfway between Albany and New York City. And yes, I was put into a Catholic school, and obviously I learned all the usual things about sexuality wasn't really talked about much. I mean, they even avoided talking about the reproductive system. They talked about the nervous system and the digestive system, but we can't talk about reproduction, so it was kind of right away, sexuality was this big taboo thing, along with all the social clues saying that you're not supposed to touch yourself in that way, and so that contributed to me being quite a bit sheltered about sexuality into maybe my early teens, and being really shy to talk about anything about sexuality. Even my mother wanted to tell me about the birds and the bees, and I didn't want to hear her talk about it, so I just went and read it all about it in an encyclopedia instead. It actually started quite innocently. A friend and I were working on Saturn for a science project, and we saw sex, and we just, because I'm pure and innocent, so. But I digress.
Thank you for digressing. Okay, so you grew up in a sheltered environment. The topic never even came up, and then one day you find you're having these fantasies. When did you first meet let's say, your very first girlfriend?
Actually, I think I was about 26 or so, maybe 25 or 26, I don't remember exactly, and it was somebody I met through an internet dating site, and I knew at this point that I really wanted to try it out with a woman. It wasn't a question of validating my bisexuality, because I wasn't one of these people who felt that I needed to experience it to know. I knew I was attracted to women and men, and it wasn't a question of doing anything or not. So I corresponded with this woman for a while online. We finally met and had a few experiences, and that didn't really work out well, but I nevertheless knew that this was going to be part of my experience, and I was going to continue in that direction.
When you've dated men, have you ever shared your sexual thoughts or the fact that you were bisexual with them? And if you did, what was typically their reaction?
Well, since I started discovering that I was bisexual, like I said, in my early 20s and accepting it, I've only been in 2 long-term relationships since then. And the first guy, I couldn't really express myself with him because he was this kind of guy who was all for it in the pornos, but in real life it was a whole other thing. And that lasted about 3 years, and I was kind of stifled with that. But then my next partner, who was going to become the father of my child, was quite accepting of it from day one. I told him right away, and he was fine with me being bi, and eventually he was fine with me wanting to experiment with women since I hadn't yet. And yeah, I could express myself with him quite well, and he wasn't one of these guys who said, oh, cool, now we can have a threesome. He wasn't really into that at all. So, and with men I've dated casually, the reactions have ranged from, okay, whatever, to, oh, cool, threesome. So there's a diversity of opinions out there on behalf of guys, I think.
You mentioned the reaction, oh, cool, threesomes, and you mentioned it in a negative way. Mm-hmm. Does that turn you off?
No, it doesn't turn me off as such. I mean, I've been in threesomes. It's not an issue. It's just the immediate assumption that bothers me, and the idea that the guy would be perceiving my bisexuality as a tool for his fantasy fulfillment. That's kind of what gets on my nerves about it. Other than that, if it's respectful, I don't have an issue with it. Like I said, it's really just, that whole kind of, fulfilling my fantasies, my pleasure, male pleasure,
Yeah, so you went, just imagined, a typical alpha male beating on his chest,
Silverback gorilla.
And that's it.
That's the image that I had in mind, too. So.
Oh, you communicated that very well, and given that this is radio, that's very important.
Oh, thank you.
Let's talk about relationship structures for a bisexual person.
Okay.
Do you believe that if someone is bisexual, that the threesome situation where you have a bisexual person and then a man and a woman as well, do you think that's a given?
I don't think it's necessarily a given. At one point I thought that maybe that was the case, but since I've been involved in being in Montreal, I've met so many people, I've seen such a diversity of ways of experiencing bisexuality that I don't think there's one standard way of experiencing relationships among bisexuals. And it ranges from the completely monogamous to the polyamorous to swingers, just like any other sexual orientation, I'd say.
One of the challenges that people have, or the public at large has, with a stereotype of a bisexual person is that a bisexual person cannot be happy or fulfilled in a monogamous relationship, being with one person, one gender, when they're attracted to the opposite gender. And I'd like your thoughts on that.
I really think it depends on the person. I mean, I know that if we take an example of the person who, for whatever reason, or because of social taboos and upbringing, have never experienced same-sex sex, for example, and they've been kind of, herded into the heterosexual category, they might get to a point in their life where, I really want to do this, and they love their partner, but they feel this need just because they've never done it. Kind of in the same way that a heterosexual who has never sexually experienced anything other than, they just kind of got married at 20 and never had sex with anyone else, might reach that point also. So I would make that comparison. Other than that, again, it's probably a question of temperament, a question of the agreement between partners. I think there's so many variables that it's hard to say there's one specific type.
In your work with Bi Unity Montreal, what have you learned about bisexual people since being associated with that organization?
What have I learned about bisexual people? That's, I guess, kind of like what I alluded to before, that there's such a diversity of ways of experiencing it, ways of perceiving it. Some people would be perfectly content having a one-on-one relationship and then just experiencing their other sex attraction, whether it be, like if they're in a same-sex relationship, they might experience all their heterosexual attractions in their head through fantasy, and that's fine with them as long as they get to express it somehow. Other people need that physical contact with both, and there's this whole variation. Some people are emotionally attracted to one sex, and some are physically attracted to the other, or vice versa. So there's really a wide range of
Actually, could you elaborate on that more, being emotionally attracted to a gender as opposed to being physically attracted?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know some bisexual people, some friends of mine, for example, who are sexually attracted to, say, men, who enjoy having sex with men, but who wouldn't see themselves being in a long-term relationship with men. Whereas they would be in a long-term relationship with women, and there would be the sexual component as well. Okay, so there's that, and it can be the other way around, and sometimes it changes too. That's the intricacy of it all, is that people change, and our sexual needs change, and our desires change. So for some people, they might go through a period of life where they feel more hetero, even though they have same-sex attraction, or vice versa, and then they might get to a point where they feel more homosexual and still have a bit of opposite sex attraction, but it's kind of back there in the back of their mind, or so again, diversity.
One of the things that I don't know if we're going to have time to talk about it before we go to our break, but for a bisexual person who may be dating someone who's not bisexual, who may be totally straight or totally gay, what reassurances can a bisexual person give to their partner if there is that possibility of change down the road?
I think it would be the same reassurance that a heterosexual or homosexual person would give their partner, because everybody changes. It's not just bisexuals, except that maybe bisexuals might have more of a tendency to admit that change because they're put in that position. But I think it's the same across the board. The reassurance is, trust me when I'm telling you that you are the one that I'm going to be with, and I think that's about the best you can do, and of course follow up with your actions, otherwise it's kind of pointless.
That is very reassuring. You're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyles. We'll be back right after this.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. Ladies, do you want the man in your life to understand you on your level? Do you want your man to be able to listen to and address all of your emotional needs? Show him how much you really want your relationship to be the best it can be. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test makes the perfect gift. The book, written by a man, for men, is endorsed by every woman that reads it. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the book I'm a Man, That's My Job, The Philosophy of a Seducer. Your inner game is as unique and personal as your signature or your fingerprints. This book provides you with the means to create your own seduction persona. By this, learn what it means to be a man and attract the women you want. Learn about how men and women think differently and how to take the lead in a relationship. This book is for you at franktalks.com. From Loser to Seducer is the story of Frank B. Kerman. This book marks the triumph of a nice guy over most of his inner demons. This includes going from being a loser to managing 5 lovers at the same time, his first Valentine's date with 2 women at the same time, and getting back the one that got away. Want to learn how you can change your life? Buy this book at franktalks.com.
Frank Talks is making the world a better place by interviewing people on pleasures and lifestyles in order to inspire and educate listeners like you about the possibilities to lead more interesting and fulfilling lives. Be sure to visit our website at www.franktalks.com for the most up-to-date information and the latest downloads of programs just like the one you are listening to now.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be. We're in studio with Nancy LeClaire. Hi Nancy, how you doing?
I'm alright, Frank. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And we're continuing with our interview. So we're talking about bisexuality. Nancy is a representative of Bi Unité Montréal. And my next question to you, Nancy, what are some of the obstacles that a bisexual person might face?
For starters, I would say that a lot of them are similar to the obstacles that a gay or lesbian person would face in terms of dealing with social taboos about sexual orientation, dealing with homophobia at large, or heterocentrism, which is the tendency that people have in the society to assume that everybody is heterosexual. In addition to that, there are certain obstacles I kind of alluded to before in terms of arriving in the queer community and finding out that even there are people who either believe that bisexuals don't exist, or that we are traitors, that we are in denial about being gay or lesbian, kind of all these stereotypes. So I guess if you put those two obstacles together and call it biphobia, you have kind of this sense of I wouldn't go as far as to call it hatred all the time, but this sense of dismay from both sides that, oh dear, they're breaking the norms.
So in other words, a bisexual doesn't belong with the straight people, but doesn't belong with the gay people either.
Well, I guess that's kind of a generalization, because like I said before also, it is getting better, so I don't want to put the queer community down, because it still provides a sense of home to a lot of bisexuals. But in a sense, I guess to a certain extent, we could say that sometimes we're made to feel as though we don't really belong anywhere.
What are some of the sacrifices that a person who is bisexual that wants to come out as a bisexual person would have to make?
I think, well, one of the that might change between males and females. Actually, there's some variation there as well. From some of my male bisexual friends, I think the main challenge is very similar to what gay men have to go through, because in North American society, female same-sex sexuality is more accepted, quote unquote, than male same-sex interactions. So they have that whole kind of stigma to overcome, especially in diverse workplaces and social situations. Whereas for females, some people would think it's easier, but it's not necessarily, because then we have that whole thing of when we out ourselves as bisexual from heterosexual males, sometimes, not all, I don't want to generalize, but sometimes we get that reaction of, oh cool, a bisexual woman. And from females it might be like, slut, that brand slut. Not that that's a bad thing, but not everybody wants that label either. So it's the assumption. It's always the assumption. So I guess those are some. When you come out as bisexual, it's almost as though people think that when you're coming out, you're announcing your bedroom activities to everybody. In the meantime, heterosexuals wear wedding rings, and so they're outing themselves all the time and saying, my husband, my wife, this, but that's okay. Whereas as soon as you say you're bisexual, it's almost as if people assume you're saying it to shock them, or just to... It's kind of weird, in a nutshell.
I never even considered the fact that wearing a wedding ring is a display of sexuality. Mm-hmm. When in fact, it very much identifies you with a particular group.
Mm-hmm. Well, up until recently, that was a heterosexual privilege, and now you can have a wedding ring and be married to somebody of the same sex. So that's changing a little bit, except that people still will tend to associate it, I think, with heterosexuality for a few decades.
I'd like to go back to the topic of relationship structures, mm-hmm. and the issue that a bisexual person is attracted to both genders, mm-hmm. and being with one gender in a monogamous relationship might mean that they have to give up experiencing the other gender, depending, of course, on the rules. Now, the topic of polyamory, being able to be involved with more than one partner, is a polyamorous relationship structure something very common amongst bisexuals?
I'd hesitate to call it necessarily common, because we need kind of some statistics to actually back that up, and we don't really have them. But I would say that it's definitely a recurring topic of conversation that comes up on discussion lists and discussion groups in informal settings, because a lot of people, when they start realizing that they're bi, will contemplate that and will ask themselves, do I have to be polyamorous to experience bisexuality? Is polyamory for me? And so, you know, some people, I mean, again, you have a whole bunch of different opinions. I've heard some bisexuals say that, oh yeah, you definitely need both when you're bi, that's what being bi is all about, so polyamory goes hand in hand with bisexuality. Whereas you have other people who say, well, you know, you have heterosexual and homosexual polyamorists, so polyamory and bisexuality are two separate entities. One is sexual orientation and the other is relationship formation. So, but there's definitely a relationship. I mean, it comes back all the time in the discussions, so it's definitely a concern.
In the area of polyamory, you can have a situation where you'll have one woman with many husbands, or possibly many wives, or one husband with many wives, possibly many husbands. Are there terminology to describe the different relationship structures?
Well, I guess what you're talking about there with husbands and wives, I guess, is if we're talking about more formal arrangements, which is not something that we really have here in Canada. We don't have legalized multiple marriages, which is actually polygamy as opposed to polyamory. So people do tend to mix those two terms up, whereas polyamory is a relationship thing where it's not going to be formalized, at least not until we have laws that allow us to do so. But, you know, you definitely have places where polygamy does exist and that it's, you know, legally sanctioned and recognized, but that's kind of a whole other ball of wax. It's kind of more culturally ingrained institutions. So I guess there's even in the polyamorous community, you have all kinds of discussions about terminology and how do you label this and label that, and it's still relatively new, right? So people are still trying to define things and put names to them and look for models. So it's kind of tricky.
A good example of that would be, how do I define my girlfriend's boyfriend's lover who I'm also involved with?
Exactly. Yeah, it's you know, I guess we have this desire to put everything in boxes, and you know that our society is kind of built around, you know, creating boxes and writing something on the side of the box so that you can easily put things in them. But we're seeing more and more that with talk of bisexuality and transsexuality and transgenderism and polyamory, that it's just getting more and more complicated to try to create all these boxes. We need too many. So
isn't that one of the areas of resistance when it comes to topics of sexuality? Specifically because there really is no way to properly define it. It's something you have to experience as opposed to something you can just easily explain. And I'm wondering, do you think that there's a way to explain it to people better?
I'm not sure, because it's hard to explain things to people when you don't know exactly where they're coming from. A wise Cree man once told me that when he was trying to tell me about his culture, and so I find it relates to this situation as well. And I guess some of what you were saying, it does scare people when they can't put something in a box because they don't know how to relate to you, and if they look at you and they can't tell if you're male or female, they panic. If they look at you and they don't know if you're attracted to men or to women, they panic. When they look at you and they see that you have two partners and that you're open about it, they don't know how to relate to you, and it scares them. So it's really hard to explain things to people when they just put this wall between themselves and you, and the only way to really get people to understand is they have to remove that wall, and we can't really do that for them. I mean, the best we can do for those of us who can, because some people really can't be out about being bi or poly or whatever because it could be dangerous depending on where they work, who they interact with, but those of us who can be without too many risks, I think that we kind of need to be, and I'm not saying that everybody has to be, but I feel sometimes that it's important that some of us are out to help people see that we're quote-unquote normal people, and that we're not, killing and raping babies or, committing vandalism or anything like that. So I think that's the only thing, is through exposure to people who are just living their lives like anybody else and who are open about having an quote-unquote alternative lifestyle.
In your work with Unity Montreal and in your own personal experiences, what are some of the most negative experiences that bisexuals may have had after coming out that you know of?
Well, this is mostly secondhand information. I haven't really had that many negative experiences, but I do have friends who have either had parents who kind of were in denial about it, in some case pushed them away a little bit. In other cases, didn't push them away, but just didn't want to talk about it. Say if a female would be in a relationship with another female, maybe her parents would not really want to address the fact that she was in a same-sex relationship. I've heard of people being picked on at work if they came out, or if they were suspected of being queer. Maybe not specifically bisexual, but if people suspect you have a same-sex attraction, they just kind of label you as gay or lesbian anyway. Things like that. I haven't heard specifically of a bisexual person being beat up or anything like that because they were bi specifically, but it could have happened. I just haven't heard about it.
In your own profession, what do you do?
I teach in a cégep.
And are you open about your sexuality with your students?
Well, it doesn't really come up. I don't hide it, but I don't necessarily come into class, "Hi, I'm Nancy, I'm your anthropology teacher, and I'm gonna be, and I'm bisexual," and it's like that in general. I'm not, if it's not in context, if it doesn't come up, but I don't hide it. If somebody were to ask me, in one case I had a class where we were talking about sexuality in a cross-cultural context, and the issue of same-sex relations came up, and some of them were just like, "Oh, that's disgusting, it's unnatural," and the discussion went on, and I was trying to calm them down. And one woman asked me, I don't know, she just came out of the blue with, "Are you telling me that you could fall in love with a woman and spend your life with her?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And then it's like, so it's that kind of thing where if it comes out and I'm asked, I'll say it. But again, it's like I was on the Sex Files. Discovery Channel interviewed me on bisexuality, so people have been coming up to me and say, "Oh, I saw you on TV, so you're bi, eh?" So I'm very public about it, so I do interviews like this on radio and on TV, so people undoubtedly see me, so in that sense I don't hide it.
Any resistance from your family?
Not at all. I have a gay brother, so and he's been out for a while, and the family's been very accepting of it, so by the time I came out as bi, there wasn't really any taboo there anymore. It just wasn't an issue. It's like, "Oh, okay, I never would have thought that, but okay." And then I told my mother when she was visiting Montreal. She went home, told my sisters. One of my sisters wrote to me to reassure me, "Oh, I still love you even if you're bi." And I'm like, "Thanks." It was cute. It was a nice sentiment,
You know what? With everything going on out there, that's more than cute. I think that was just really great of her.
Mm-hmm.
You have a son?
Yes.
And how old's your son?
He's 6 years old.
6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
When he gets older and he starts asking you questions about sexuality, how are you going to bring up the topic that you're bi, and will it even be an issue, do you think?
Bad, 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 bad. No sex. No, I mean, just kidding. Just kidding. I had to be a little bit evil. I'm going to be open about it in terms of, letting them know about all these diverse forms of sexuality and of sexual orientation and love and attraction. Yeah, love is in it too. People sometimes think it's all about sex, but love and he's going to be free to be whoever he wants to be, and he's going to know that I'm bi because he's going to know that sometimes mommy has a girlfriend, sometimes she has a boyfriend, and that's okay. He's just going to grow up in that kind of open atmosphere.
What about, have you ever gotten any resistance from your son's friends' parents maybe where they tell their kids not to play with your son?
It hasn't happened yet. I mean, he's only 6, and that really hasn't occurred. I mean, he doesn't really see kids from school outside of school, and the couple friends he does have from outside of school, I don't really, it just doesn't occur. The only time something ever came up was at his birthday party when another bisexual friend of mine who was there with her daughter, and we were talking about Unité Montréal, and then this other mother was asking us, oh, what association is this? And I just told her it's an association of bisexuals, and she was like, oh, okay. And she looked a little bit puzzled, but then she was listening, and she was kind of curious, so she was open. So I haven't, nothing negative has happened yet. I'll keep you posted.
Does that ever worry you that, sometime down the road, your son might get picked on because you've been so open about your life?
It does cross my mind sometimes that he could at some point be somehow penalized somewhere by someone because of who his mother is. And that has crossed my mind a few times. It has scared me a little bit. And at the same time, I'm like, if everybody shut up and went home because of that kind of fear, then nothing would get done. So I think that the best I can do is give him the tools that he needs to cope with being picked on if he ever is, and that's, teach him to be able to defend himself. I'm not pro-violence, but I certainly want him to be able to defend himself if things get violent. I don't want him to just say, yes, don't beat me up and cower in a corner. So I'm just going to equip him with all the tools he needs to cope.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and we'll be back right after this.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. Ladies, do you want the man in your life to understand you on your level? Do you want your man to be able to listen to and address all of your emotional needs? Show him how much you really want your relationship to be the best it can be. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test makes a perfect gift. The book, written by a man, for men, is endorsed by every woman that reads it. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the book I'm a Man, That's My Job, The Philosophy of a Seducer. Your inner game is as unique and personal as your signature or your fingerprints. This book provides you with the means to create your own seduction persona. By this, learn what it means to be a man and attract the women you want. Learn about how men and women think differently and how to take the lead in a relationship. This book is for you at franktalks.com. From Loser to Seducer is the story of Frank B. Kerman. This book marks the triumph of a nice guy over most of his inner demons. This includes going from being a loser to managing 5 lovers at the same time, his first Valentine's date with 2 women at the same time, and getting back the one that got away. Want to learn how you can change your life? Buy this book at franktalks.com.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles, and I'm Frank because I have to be.
You sure do.
Don't interrupt me when I am doing my intro. You are very, very, very bad. We're in studio today with Nancy Leclerc, who is a nasty little pain in the butt sometimes.
I've been so nice up till now.
Yes, up till now.
I'm almost done. I have to be a little bit evil. Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Nancy Leclerc represents an organization called Bi Unité Montréal. It's an organization for bisexuals. And why don't you give us the website address for people who are interested in getting to know more?
I sure can. It's www.biunitemontreal.org. That's spelled B-I-U-N-I-T-E, Montreal, all in one word, .org.
And for people who, let's say, are not in the Montreal area, does your organization offer them anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's the website that has a lot of resources, a lot of information, mostly in French for now, hopefully someday bilingual, but there are links also to all kinds of organisms, such as Bi Montreal, which is an English group, bilingual as well somewhat, but mostly English. We have an online Yahoo group, so we do have members from Europe even, some little towns in Belgium who have no local resources, and they're on our mailing list, and they at least get the online discussions. So that's pretty much what we can offer them. The website, the links section, the information, and the online group.
Okay, great. You had mentioned something earlier in this interview, during one of the classes you gave, you're a professor of anthropology.
That's right.
You mentioned different type of relationship structures in cross-cultural context.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us that are not total academics, what exactly does that mean?
Okay, well, all it means is that every society defines its own rules for marriage and other kinds of relationships. So even though sometimes people think that same-sex sexuality and multiple relationships are purely a Western phenomenon, in fact, it's existed for a long time in a lot of places. So you do have places where there's an acceptance of polygamy, for example, which is one person having more than one spouse. And what people usually think when they hear polygamy is a man having more than one wife, and that is indeed more common, especially in places like Africa and even some native North American societies before European contact. But there are a couple of instances of the other way around, where you have a woman who can have more than one husband. And in some societies, extramarital sex is fine because you're not necessarily marrying somebody that you love. You're marrying somebody that is in the right family that your family wants to form an alliance with. So marriage is not always about a relationship between two people. It's an alliance between families. So sometimes you have to marry somebody that you don't really love, so in some cases it's accepted that you will actually have affairs with other people. As long as it doesn't interfere with your spousal duties and your familial duties, you're fine. In other cases you have the opposite, right? Total monogamy. And so there's really a lot of cultural variation. Or there used to be. Now with kind of what I would call the Western Empire, that's kind of, sorry to say it so harshly, but messed up a lot of societies. You have the Western norm has kind of infiltrated a lot of places. So there's maybe less diversity than there once was.
So what you're saying is that the way the Western culture promotes its version of monogamy, where you're completely monogamous to one partner, totally faithful, you don't have any sexual contact with people outside of that primary relationship, this is not necessarily the model that exists in other parts of the world, nor did it exist in history. Is this right?
Right, it's not typical. Our whole idea of the monogamous couple and the nuclear family is not a human universal. In fact, in this classic anthropological study, now I'm being the academic, but there was a study, I think in the 50s or 60s or something, that's always referred to in the anthro books about, I think it was 80, and I'm not good with remembering actual numbers, but 80-something% of societies that were in the anthropological record that had polygamy as an ideal form of marriage. Okay, not necessarily that statistically it was more common. Monogamy is actually more common because sometimes people can't afford to be polygamous even if it's an ideal, but still the idea that it was the ideal form of marriage is present in a lot of places.
Can you give me some examples of either places or cultures that were able to exist without the super strict monogamous structure that we're exposed to here in North America?
I'd have to dig for some specific examples, names of actual societies, because I have all these things in my head here, but in terms of not being strictly monogamous all the time, I mean, you have some, maybe a couple of African societies where it wasn't necessarily, people wouldn't say, oh, you have to have an affair, but if you did, you weren't ostracized or anything like that. I'm thinking in particular of and I have a hard time saying these people's names, Showan Hansi or something, they're hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert who, people people were very sexual at a very young age. They were playing with people of the same sex, people of the opposite sex when they were like 10 or 12, and that was okay. And then later in adulthood, they kind of privileged fidelity. It was an ideal, but people had affairs, and it wasn't like, oh my God, like this big soap opera drama, so.
Based on your studies in anthropology, how important was religion as a factor in the development of relationship structures?
Well, it's very important because in every society, the way that people form their ideas usually has something to do with some kind of worldview, and very often that worldview has a religious component. So usually there's some kind of explanation that whatever is considered the norm in that society is divinely ordained. And definitely when we're talking about the Western impact before Christianity had a lot to do with removing more traditional modes of relating in many societies and replacing it with the Christian ideal of monogamy, and not only of monogamy, but monogamy with male dominance. Okay, and what this did is that it removed a lot of people's family structures that they had relied on for survival, and it just kind of messed everything up.
Let's get back to your own personal life, your own way of learning about your own bisexuality. If you could go back in time and visit yourself at a much younger age, what advice would you give to yourself?
I guess I would give myself the advice of being less afraid to go out and get information, and just not being so hung up on what I had learned in my childhood, just, being more relaxed about everything.
When someone approaches you and they know you're bisexual, they're struggling with their own sexual identity, what advice do you give them?
Well, I usually, depending on their own situation and their age and, where they're at and what they know, I would usually tell them, say if they have internet access, to explore the web, because the internet has been amazing for bisexuals and other groups of people who've been marginalized, because it allows you to get information in an anonymous way. So it's a fantastic way of getting information, reading stuff, self-evaluation, self-assessment in terms of how ready am I to be out in the quote-unquote real world. Also networking. You can be on these mailing lists and have an anonymous nickname. Nobody knows who you are. You can talk to people online. That would be a first step for somebody who's really struggling. Before they go out in the real world and start telling people that they're bi, go and inform yourself. See if this is really something you're comfortable with.
Are there any people that you personally look up to in the bisexual community?
I had never really actually thought of that. I mean, I'd have to say anybody that's been, that's promoted an acceptance of bisexuality, and there are a number of people that are doing that. I mean, the classic name is Robin Oakes at the Bisexual Resource Center, who got married with her female partner in Massachusetts when it first became legal, and but there are many others, and I'm hard-pressed to come up with all their names off the top of my head, but all these people that have been out there and have been risking their neck pretty much to help others who were kind of hiding back in the shadows.
What would you say to someone who, let's say a parent, who's just found out that their son or daughter is bisexual, and they're not really sure how to cope? Mm-hmm. What advice would you give them?
I would tell them that ultimately they should be happy that their child has found something that they're comfortable with. They should be proud that their child has felt close enough to them to tell them, to feel comfortable with them enough to tell them, because that's not the case all the time. And that I tell them also the same thing, to go and read things that bisexuals have to say about their own sexuality, become informed either with their child or independently of their child. Go read books, read stuff on the internet, ask questions, just raise your own awareness.
Nancy, it's been absolutely wonderful having you here on Frank Talks again.
Thank you.
We have a parting gift for you. It is a bottle of pre-mixed strawberry daiquiri alcohol.
Yay!
And we certainly hope that you're going to enjoy this. We hope that you'll come back and do some more Frank Talks with us.
Okay.
Okay. That was easy.
Hey, just bring out the strawberry daiquiri. That was supposed to be a hiccup.
You know, this is supposed to be like a classy show. That just...
Then why'd you invite me?
Oh! Hey, no self-deprecating humor here on Frank Talks.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Nancy. And why don't you give us that By Unité Montréal website again, please?
Okay, it's www.biunitemontreal.org. That's BIUNITE Montreal.org.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. Ladies, do you want the man in your life to understand you on your level? Do you want your man to be able to listen to and address all of your emotional needs? Show him how much you really want your relationship to be the best it can be. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test makes the perfect gift. The book, written by a man, for men, is endorsed by every woman that reads it. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Need help with love, sex, dating and relationships? Visit franktalks.com.
Need help with love, sex, dating, and relationship issues? Help from Frank Kermit, the best-selling author and Canada's most international relationship coach, is only a click away at franktalks.com. Coaching available in person, by phone, and by Skype. For singles, couples, and alternative lifestyles, franktalks.com.
What do you do when you feel like a fool? When your heart has been broken again? Pick up the phone or get onto Skype and talk on a private session. Yeah, get a little help from Frank Talks. Whoa, whoa, get by with a little help from Frank Talks. You gotta try a little help from Frank Talks. What do you do when your love goes away? Try coaching one-on-one. How do I sign up to turn things around? Just sign up at franktalks.com. Yeah, get by with help from Frank Talks. I get by with a little help from Frank Talks. Time to try a little help from Frank Talks. Does it cost a lot of money? It's the best rate going around. Could it cost a lot of money? Oh, it's worth every cent that you will put down. Yeah. Frank Talks.com. Oh, you got to go to get your help from Frank Talks.com. Yes, we're certain, just read the reviews. Frank knows his stuff, and Frank's got goods. Good love can soon